All right.
All right, you're on. Welcome to the Ingenuism Weekly podcast. Robert is not with us, but as we're wrapping up the year, I thought we could take about an hour today to talk about some of the
All right.
biggest tech stories, progress
All
related
right. You're on.
stories of 2021. And just as Time Magazine always insists, these aren't the best, but they are the most important stories. But I do want to start off with, I think, the positive one, and it's the obvious one, which is, 2021 was the year where we were able to distribute a very large number of vaccines to help with the pandemic, which I think is an amazing achievement. It hasn't played out exactly maybe the way that we've hoped, but what's your take on uh, how we should think about the getting those vaccines created and getting them produced in the numbers we have, which I think is a major underlooked achievement.
Yeah, I mean, this is so. First, it is a massive achievement. I think people had false expectations about what exactly it would achieve. I think resulting from a lack of understanding of the COVID virus itself and its ability to mutate, and the nature of vaccination, that it A, wanes, and B, we were hoping, I think a lot of people were hoping that once you got vaccinated, you would never get COVID, that it was gone. And it turns out that none of that is true, that COVID does mutate and therefore gets around some of the vaccine protection. And second, that people can get COVID even if they're vaccinated. And worse, they can spread COVID even if they're vaccinated, which means that we cannot achieve, and I think it was unrealistic ever to think we could achieve kind of zero COVID, that COVID would go away. But what vaccines do, which is pretty amazing, is they clearly make COVID not a big deal. That is, they dramatically reduce the number of people hospitalized, and they dramatically reduce the number of people that die from COVID, so that once vaccinated, and maybe this is going to require an annual boost if COVID stays very deadly, if it becomes milder and becomes just like the flu, maybe we won't need the boost. But you might get a boost once a year, like you get a flu vaccine. And with that, COVID becomes just like, in a sense, the flu. It just becomes like a cold. You might still get it, but it's not going to be serious, and you're not going to land up in a hospital, and you're not going to get sick. And so the vaccines have been, in that sense, an enormous achievement. The speed at which they develop, more than anything. The mRNA platform, which is now a vaccine platform, they just tried to use the platform to do vaccines for flu. Unfortunately, it looks like they're no better than regular flu vaccines at their first attempts and the first trials, but they're going to be trying to produce vaccines for malaria, which could theoretically save 1 million lives a year. They are going to try to do vaccines using mRNA technology for a variety of different viruses. And ultimately, what could really be a game changer in terms of human longevity is if they can get a vaccine for some cancers, or a significant number of cancers, which is why Moderna and BioNTech first got into the business. They didn't get into the business of mRNA because of COVID or because of flu. They got into the business in order to do cancer. And now, from the experience they've gained from COVID, there's a chance that this might be an efficacious treatment. We don't know, but the upside is so huge that it's fantastic that we're getting the opportunity. I think one of the things that COVID has done, for better and for worse, right, is that it's made it evident how people have a hard time thinking about probabilities, have a hard time thinking about healthcare, have a hard time thinking about risk and risk return, and these kind of trade-offs. And of course, the more politicized we've made COVID, the less we've allowed individuals to engage and experiment and take the personal responsibility of thinking about these things. And One of the things that I think a big lesson from COVID is going to be, we need to educate people about, need to find ways to educate people about how to think probabilistically, about how to think about science, how to think about statistics, how to think about this risk return trade-off, because it has implications for everything you do in life. As ingenuous, in Ingenuism, we talk about failure and learning from failure. Well, one of the ways to learn from failure is to really think about the risk return trade-offs about these things. And if people don't have that capacity, it's a real problem. So, if people become super risk averse because they can't think properly about the upsides, that becomes a real problem. So,
yeah, and I mean, that part of the issue is that we were feeding into that from day one. Certainly, political leaders, the idea that we were going to beat the disease or conquer the disease, meaning eliminate it, I think was always delusional. And all of the reputable scientists and medical people that I heard were, what you can do is you can turn it into a regular risk of life. And that was always the proper goal. And by that standard, vaccines were incredibly successful. Even if you have to get regular boosters, Matt Iglesias had a little snarky, but I thought a good line about exercise doesn't work. You have to do it over and over again to keep getting the results. We've been lied to.
That's good.
I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. Like the fact that something doesn't give you infinite perfect protection doesn't mean that it's not a huge benefit to human life, viewed by the standard of this is a new risk and we were able to turn it from catastrophic into manageable.
I mean, sadly, COVID from the beginning was not left to scientists, was not left to, it was not taken out, or it was not dealt with responsibly by politicians. It was politicized from day one. All the institutions relating to science, this is the danger of the government getting involved. I mean, we might, some people argue about the benefits of government doing basic science, or government doing certain things regarding to science. But the real danger of government getting involved in science is that science then gets politicized, and then people don't know if they become skeptical of the government or they become skeptical of a particular political party in government, then they become skeptical of the science. And it's very difficult to separate what's political, what's not political. And the more commentary you get from chief scientists and from chief political this and chief political that, the more difficult it is for people to actually analyze this instead of doing, trying to do their own research and find authentic experts in the field who can help us. And now everybody gets assigned based on kind of their political affiliation, what their point of view is. So yes, I mean, the biggest story health-wise is still COVID. Vaccines were a massive achievement. I think the other achievement, which we won't benefit from in 2021, but hopefully we'll benefit from in 2022, are the new antiviral drugs. I think Merck's drug might be a dud, but it really does look like Pfizer's drug is going to be significant. It certainly has. There's reason to believe that it could be very efficacious in terms of, again, not preventing you from getting the disease, but from preventing you from being really, really sick and from dying from the disease. And that's the main thing that medicine should be about. It's impossible to eradicate viruses, but it is possible to manage the impact on a human population.
Yeah, so I want to talk also about what I would put as a second or distinct story, which is kind of the impacts economic wise of the pandemic. But I think to stay on the trajectory we're at, I think there's also a story of just progress in health technology generally. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that, now you can get eye drops that, you take them in 8 hours. He doesn't have to wear his glasses. They're a bit pricey right now, but we've had a lot of these small breakthroughs that, a lot of us are not hearing about unless our doctor's telling about them. But I think there's been just it used to be you'd hear about, okay, this is a big breakthrough. And then 10 years later, you'd hear nothing more. And we're starting to see a lot of these new technologies actually come to fruition, as with mRNA. Anything that jumps out at you that you think is particularly exciting?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot going on. in the healthcare space. And you can start with the ability now to test for so many different things, and to get results quickly and to change behavior accordingly. The testing now is cheap and it's incredibly effective. I just heard recently that you can get a blood test now that gives you warning signs about the beginnings of cancers. I think they test for 50 different cancers, and of course it's not definitive. You can then need to do additional screening, but it's a wow. I mean, if you could catch cancers early, then you could potentially eradicate many cancers and eradicate their effect on human mortality, because cancer is the second largest killer, I think, after heart disease. But even with heart disease, there are now incredible monitors. I mean, my watch, I can do a little ECG on my watch, and if there are any kind of heart palpitations or any real problems with my heart, I could probably detect them a lot earlier than I could before. Generally, I'd say also that the whole tracking health phenomena is pretty amazing. We've got now more and more of these health trackers that, used to be a few years ago where, they could count your steps. Wasn't that cool? And,
Right.
and it was cool. We all kind of monitored how many steps we did, and we tried to do more. And that's a healthy thing and a good thing. But now they give you blood oxygen level, which just I remember 10 years ago, you couldn't get a blood oxygen level without being invasive. That is, without getting blood. And now, and then you could, but it was very expensive. So only some hospitals had it. And now you can get a little ring that you can put on your finger or a wristband, and it will give you, whenever you want, your blood oxygen level. And that includes now the latest health trackers have temperature, sleep trackers that give you a breakdown. You used to have to go into a lab to get the breakdown between REM sleep and deep sleep. And now you can do it every night on your phone and become obsessed about how you're doing in your sleep, as I often do with, data. Data is amazing, but it is obsessive for us data guys. It's easy to get obsessed about the different data parameters, but it really is amazing. And while today, maybe it's still early and you could argue, a lot of this is kind of cool data, but we don't know exactly what to do with it yet. I mean, let's project 5-10 years into the future, and you can monitor your health on a minute by minute basis. You can monitor key things. You can identify problems early. Just the ability to track and the ability to catch things early should add years to our life expectancy. Hopefully decades to our life expectancy. Never mind all the drugs that are coming down the line. I'm particularly excited about CRISPR. I just hope that the anti-science mobs don't stop progress there. But CRISPR, which is gene editing, and the ability to change genes, and you could edit genes on somebody who's alive and fix a problem, or you can edit embryos' genes and make sure that their child never has the problem before they're even born. So just stunning technology with huge upside, as big as maybe the technology revolution. We'll see if it's allowed to advance, with big moral implications, but also a lot of implications with regard to Ingenuism. What does it mean to fail? Can we allow failure? What's the level of failure we can allow? Again, very important that people start learning and understanding statistics and how they work, and how kind of risk analysis works. So I'm excited, very excited about the future of bioengineering more broadly, health, longevity, things like that. I think the during COVID, a lot of these technologies have accelerated, and a lot of money is being invested. One of the advantages, I'm going on long here, but one of the advantages of Moderna and BioNTech and Pfizer doing so well with the vaccines is that they got this massive market caps, and they managed to raise huge amounts of capital at very low valuations, particularly a company like Moderna, which was really a startup, and BioNTech, which is also a startup. And that money is all going into R&D, and that money, it makes some people rich, but mainly it's going back into R&D. And I think a lot biotech generally did well And a lot of that money is being plowed back into research and development, and all of us will be the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah, so I want to move on then to the next story, which comes out of the pandemic, but we've seen dramatic economic changes, many directly related, many indirectly. So everything from we've had supply chain problems that thankfully seem to be starting to sort themselves out, the rise of remote work, and now that companies are trying to bring back people into the office, we're seeing that a lot of people don't want to give up those remote jobs. We've seen a lot of interesting studies with nothing really definitive on kind of what are the impacts of this. I think it's still there's a lot that remains to be seen about how it impacts productivity, how it impacts people at the start of their careers trying to build relationships and so on. And then we've seen what's gone by various names, but I forget, the great resignation, the great reshuffling, whatever you want to call it, where a lot of older workers are leaving the workforce. So a lot changing. Certainly, I don't think you can say this is pandemic related, though I'm sure there's some overlap. Rising inflation has become a big concern.
Well, rising inflation is directly related to the economic policy of the pandemic. So there's no question about that. But yes, when you get a shock that is both economic and cultural, and COVID is both economic and cultural because it affected us not just in terms of production and consumption, but it also affected our patterns of behavior, our expectations. Stop going to the office, stop interacting with other people, stop going to concerts. Maybe, I mean, a lot has changed in American culture over the last 2 years. Maybe demand for certain services has changed, not just demand for goods. You expect to see real economic consequences for that. And certainly given the government's response to COVID, which was to lock us down and to define some jobs as essential and others as not, kind of somewhat arbitrarily. And you would expect a period of adjustment and real costs involved. Now, knowing this, our politicians chose to try to mitigate those costs by printing up a bunch of money and basically sending checks to everybody. And people didn't feel the economic pain of COVID because the government compensated and eliminated it. So it is a real question. So now we're starting to feel the consequence of all this. So people's behavior change. Okay, so that's how that's going to change. Well, that's going to change the value of commercial real estate potentially. It's going to change the way businesses do work. It's going to change whether we have large offices. But the extent of that is still to be determined. I mean, yes, people don't want to go to work, but some companies are insisting, like Apple's insisting. They've got little rebellions, and maybe that's part of the Great Resignation, is young people saying, no, we like working at home. Is that the best thing for young people to do? I think we talked about this with Robert on one of the podcasts, right? I mean, young people probably have the most benefit from the networking and connection that comes from going to the office, and particularly meeting more senior, more experienced employees that they can learn from, forming connections that then can be helpful later on in their careers, and doing things like that. So, but young people are resisting doing that in spite of the fact that it's in their self-interest. So it's not clear how big of an effect it's going to be. So there's volatility because people don't know. So it's not clear what the building is worth. It's not clear what the business is worth. Not clear the way businesses are going to interact into the future. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And then, of course, supply chains have been hit significantly again, because in a sense, we created artificial demand by writing everybody checks in spite of the fact that they weren't working. The fact that they weren't working meant that there was less production, and not just less production in the United States, but less production all over the world. It meant that the truck drivers weren't driving and that port employees weren't working, or if they were working, they might not have been working full time or the regular load that they work because of COVID, or if they were working maybe in California with the insanity over there. They might have been working with masks, which reduces their productivity significantly. So you get a shock to production, you get a shock to supply. And yet demand is not really that affected because demand is artificially through the government, sustained through these stimulus checks. And you get supply chain issues. It's not surprising. It should have been expected. It would have been shocking if it didn't happen. Also, demand is shifting. It shifted during the pandemic from services, which we couldn't consume because the government didn't allow us to consume them, to products. We had money, so we bought stuff. And again, markets were not anticipating it. It takes markets time to adjust to it. Shipping was not expecting it. So none of this is surprising, certainly not after the fact. It's easy to explain what happened. It's not that hard to explain. But what is interesting is for the first time in many decades of people believing that you can print as much money as you want, you can run as many deficits as you want, but inflation won't budge. And you can drop interest rates to zero and inflation won't rise. After really decades now, it's certainly 2 decades of people thinking that, certainly after 2008, people thinking that. And people not expecting, as a consequence, people not expecting any consequence to the stimulus that happened last year. Suddenly, inflation's on the rise. And inflation's on the rise. People say it's transitory and so on. It doesn't look like it. So the producers' price inflation number came out yesterday, highest it's been in decades. We know the CPI is highest it's been in decades. This looks like real inflation. This looks like something was different in the way government responded to the pandemic vis-a-vis money than in the way they responded to financial crisis. Now, I have some theories about why that is, but that's going to be the big thing that economists look at now. Okay, what's different? And and we can, I don't know, this is the time or place, but at some point, the whole issue of what is money, what constitutes money, how do you measure money, what is a measure of increasing money supply, is an economic problematic, and I don't think people have a good handle on it. And as a consequence, they mismeasure. There's a lot of mismeasurement. But it does look like this experiment we just ran with writing people checks and giving it to them, which is very similar to what Bernanke used to call helicopter money, that is dropping money from helicopters. It looks like that causes inflation. Why exactly that's different, how it's different, in what way it's different, those are all things that economists are going to have to work out and figure out. But it does look like we've got inflation. And it doesn't look like it's going to go away very quickly. And there is an ingenious aspect to, we should write about this. There's an ingenious aspect to inflation. And that is one of the real damaging things about inflation is, particularly when it's like it is unanticipated and you don't really know what's causing it and how big it's going to be, is that it makes it difficult to plan. And therefore it makes it difficult for entrepreneurs to project into the long run and make the kind of investments that are needed for economic progress and for innovation and for success. It makes exploration much more difficult because not only are you now controlling for all the difficulties and the risk factors that are involved with regular stuff, now you have an additional risk factor, which is inflation. And how it's going to affect, particularly unexpected inflation, how it's going to affect your business. So it does create greater uncertainty and therefore reduce our ability to innovate and progress.
So, well, that discussion went more negative than I expected, for understandable reasons. But for me, the most negative story of the year was the real continued and I think increased attack on big technology companies. And it seemed like every other week there was some Silicon Valley leader or several of them hauled in front of Congress on this and that kind of berating. I think some of the states even were considering and passed different kinds of legislation to go after big tech. It happened in Florida, happened in Texas. And I think just in general, that in my lifetime, I've never seen the culture this anti-Silicon Valley. And the if you just, go back, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, really, if you go back a decade when Steve Jobs died, it was still very much celebratory. People excited about the products that were put out. Businessmen generally were vilified, and occasionally, somebody like Bill Gates would be seen as, oh, he's too strong and too powerful. But overall, I thought there's a kind of positive view of Silicon Valley, and I think that has really turned, and very clearly turned, this year.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's been building, so it wasn't unexpected. It's been building certainly. I think even before Trump's presidency, I think it started building in the Obama years, but it certainly accelerated during the Trump, but from both sides of the aisle, who blame big tech for all our problems. I think many on the left blame social media for Trump's rise and Trump's success in achieving the presidency, and his overwhelming dominance on 40% of Americans who, no matter what he did, viewed him positively. And of course, the right blamed big tech for Donald Trump's demise, and of course everything in between, the culture, what's happening with the culture, the negativity, and all of that. So it is we have reverted back to kind of the attitude I think some Americans had towards big business in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with the rise of the trust busters and antitrust. But I think it's much worse now, because I think it's much deeper, the distrust of wealth and the distrust of business. I think it's in technology, it's partially driven by people don't even understand the technology. The technology is so advanced now that people don't know how to relate to it exactly. But it's also big tech's fault to some extent. And that is, and you can see this particularly with Facebook and to some extent Twitter, they politicized themselves. They bought into the political side. They now have, we saw a friend of ours resign from Facebook because he said it's become a kind of the political monolithic culture and that political monolith is affecting how Facebook is run, and certainly affecting the quality of being an employee there. So it's to some extent, the left has kind of is eating itself by making these companies overly political and putting a political agenda at the forefront. I mean, now there's the story, and I don't know the details, I haven't researched it yet, but about the potentially Apple paying $240 billion to Chinese government to kind of bribe them to leave them alone. There has been building over the years, this big tech participating with, helping the Chinese government with surveillance and all stuff like that. So big tech has not helped itself in the sense that it has not stood up to its own for the values that it says it represents, and all of that has fed into this really, really negative, horrifically negative attitude towards technology, which is going to make it very difficult for innovation and progress in the future if we have this deep distrust and hatred of the companies that are creating the innovation and making it possible.
Well, and I think it's even worse than that, because within many of these companies, there seems to be a discomfort with how powerful they are, and disagreement, whether from the right or the left, of how they're conducting themselves in the world. And so it's like the guns are all pointed from all sides, and even within, there's the sense of lack of confidence, lack of conviction that we're doing what's right, and it's no longer even like us against the world. It's us against the world, which is not a very good place to have the kind of pinnacle of U.S. innovation being.
I think that's right, and and I think that emboldens the bad guys and emboldens, for example, the Chinese. So it ultimately it encourages some of our political leaders to get more involved in politics than I think they otherwise would. So everything becomes politicized. And this is, of course, part of the problem of the government having it, from a regulatory perspective, from a tax perspective, and from just an opinion perspective, having influence over all these different realms in our lives, is that all these realms then become politicized.
I mean, we've been talking about this for forever. I mean, in our first book, we were talking about the way in which Microsoft went from $0, zero presence in DC. We're just focused on making products to, some of the biggest amount of spending after, they were in the targets of antitrust, and saying, look, the more that you're kind of going to try to control these companies, the more that they're going to try to exert control. And I think, unfortunately, that has just played out more rapidly than I expected.
And it seems that it's only going to get worse, because there doesn't seem to be a presence, in politics today that is focused on separating those two out. I mean, and one of the goals with Ingenuism is, in an apolitical kind of way, and in a just a purely economic kind of way, to show that, look, what you're sacrificing here is innovation, growth, economic prosperity, and what you want is a robust tech market. What you want is healthy competition, real competition. I mean, our next newsletter, the newsletter that we're about to publish on Thursday, is going to have this great story about the demise of Kodak, one of the most successful companies in American history. And it's going to tell the story of the demise. Why demise? Because it faced competition from innovation. And it didn't, I don't want to give it away because I want all you guys to read it, but it's a really amazing story. And it has these real lessons for the attitudes towards today. If you're worried about any of these companies being too big, then the best thing you can do, even if you're worried about that, I don't think you should be worried about it, but even if you are, the best thing you can do is lay off the sector generally, and let its competitors chew them up, because to the extent that they will fail, to the extent that they, no big company has really survived. How many companies at the top of the S&P 500 today are the same as they were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago? Almost none. Certainly 100 years, but even 50, 40. So it's, all these companies, all the big tech companies, with the exception of Microsoft, are new to the top of the S&P 500 list. Apple, 20 years ago, was starting its rebound. 25 years ago was on the verge of bankruptcy, literally on the verge of bankruptcy. And here it is where it is today. The other companies didn't even exist. And what about the companies that are being started right now, or that started 5 years ago, that we barely know anything about? That are going to overtake all of these companies in the years to come. But if we restrict innovation, if we restrict connection, if we restrict the exploration process, then we will never know what could have happened. And so it's really interesting. It's a little scary, but as we know, there's tons of innovation going on in spite of this, and what we need to make sure is that the government lays off so that this innovation can actually happen.
So one of I think the more positive stories this year is we saw kind of the first coming to fruition of the so-called billionaire space race. And indeed, Elon Musk was named Time Man of the Year. And, we got to see Jeff Bezos head into space, Richard Branson. And, there was some debate about this, people saying, oh, is this the best way for them to spend their money? And there is a question of like, all right, what is this? Where is this leading us? But in terms of just something that was like visual and visceral about human achievement and kind of, all right, we're done taking these steps backwards. We ventured out into space and then basically didn't do anything new. And people saying, no, we're actually going to make this a sustainable, economically sustainable venture so that we can really explore space and try to figure out what cool stuff we can do there. I thought it was a really wonderful thing to see, even if I don't think, compared to like medical technology, I don't think we're going to see the payoff in the next, 5 years in terms of a real meaningful benefit. But in terms of something that's just pure cool and I think has no downsides, That's sort of how I viewed it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a beautiful thing to see. It's inspiring. It also shows what happens when the government steps back a little bit and allows these entrepreneurs to do their thing. What was it? I mean, the price drop in getting a satellite into space that resulted from SpaceX. I can't remember the numbers. We wrote about this. It's just astounding. NASA could have never achieved this by itself. That is that having entrepreneurs who need to make money off of this and who can sell their services, it's just stunning what all these people have achieved. And I think while we won't see the benefits of getting people out into space, I think we'll see some of the benefits of getting into space cheaply. One of the topics we had listed to talk about is the Starlink. And I think Elon Musk Starlink, this is SpaceX putting up thousands of satellites into low orbit and then making internet basically access ubiquitous around the world. You can go to Antarctica and get, I assume, and get internet access because the satellites are right up there. And I loved my favorite tweet of the year. You didn't ask me. My favorite tweet of the year was.
Well, now I'm super curious.
Favorite tweet of the year was Elon Musk tweeted about Starlink that it's going to supply internet access to every country, every place, every corner in the world will have. And somebody tweeted back to him and said, well, what about the local regulations and the local regulators? And Elon Musk, I think the tweet says they can shake their fist at the sky. And that's brilliant. I mean, that's witch doctor stuff. I mean, that's exactly right. They can shake their fist at the sky. In other words, they will be impotent and incompetent and have no ability to impact this. How cool is that, right? So that by far is my favorite tweet of the year. So, and I think probably my second, third, fourth, and fifth favorite tweets are probably all from Elon Musk. I wish he lived up to some of the good tweets that he has. He doesn't always live up to it, but. So space age, yes, it's inspiring. I remember as a kid reading a book, the man who bought the moon, something like that, by Robert Heinlein, about private enterprise reaching the moon first. This is before Apollo. This was written in the late 50s. And the idea was that the United States government basically did a homesteading act on the moon and basically said, whoever gets there, gets to use it. And it spurs a competition between private entrepreneurs to who can get the moon first. And because they get to use it as a resource. It's still not too late. I still think the United States can do that for meteorites, can do that for Mars, can do that for much of the moon. Whoever gets there first and fences off an area, you can do whatever you want in that area. It's yours. The United States will recognize their property rights and defend their property rights if the time comes to that such a defense is necessary. And that would be a really cool way to develop space is let's get, again, the same competitive juices, the same kind of connection, the same kind of trial and error, and that we have in every other field of technology. Let's get it applied to space. We're seeing a little bit of that with these companies competing, but if you actually gave them property rights, I think you'd see even more competition.
All right, so there's two more stories I want to get to, and I don't want to end on a sour note. So let's take on China next. Now, I think there's a lot that we can say about China, but just big picture-wise, I think we've seen a real, first of all, there's everything concerned with the pandemic, and maybe we can talk about that. But I think there's a continued turn against its own companies and technology companies exerting more control. Well, I'll leave it to you since you follow China much more closely than I do.
Yeah, so China has been turning away from markets for about 6-7 years now, maybe 8. But it really accelerated. It's been accelerating, and it really accelerated this last year. And I think under COVID, and so that it now is trying to control and regulate its tech industry, which to a large extent was left alone. It's trying to break up big companies so that the suspicion of Silicon Valley that we have in the United States seems to also happen in China. Just when they want to act on it, they can act much faster than we can. We actually have a process. All the you need in China is for Xi to decide something, and it happens. The advantage of having dictatorships, which I think some of our politicians long for, so they are breaking up tech. They've some of the biggest tech companies, some of the most successful tech companies in the world and in history have been Chinese, and they have mostly suffered over the last couple of years from the Chinese government, particularly again over the last 12 months. That is destroying innovation. It's destroying the ability to explore in China. Now we're moving away from a permissionless economy to everything is based on permission. It was never a permissionless economy, but at least there were segments of the economy that felt permissionless. Now, even those segments, now you need permission. So everything is now controlled, regulated, and limited. And so you've taken one of the great, I think, advancements in the world over the last 40 years is the relative liberation of China. It's the addition of 1.3, 1.2 billion people to a connected world. The fact that in China you had thousands and thousands of engineers, which is the real reason tech companies outsourced and went to produce in China, is because of the number of engineers they could hire almost immediately. So you've taken away a billion people exploring, and now you're taking away a billion people the connection. And here, COVID is an important story, because one of the things that happened in China vis-a-vis COVID is that because they have obviously not been transparent in terms of what happened with the beginning of COVID, because they're not sharing information, because they're not allowing for proper investigation, there is real suspicion about them hiding a lot. I mean, there's real reason to believe it, which makes people doubt whether we should work with the Chinese. It makes us not trust kind of the data we get from them. And that is in trust, as we've written about in some of our Ingenuism articles, trust is a key feature of Ingenuism. And if once you destroy trust, you destroy connection. If you destroy connection, you destroy innovation and you destroy progress, or you slow it down significantly. And I think that once we stop trusting the Chinese, whether it's government agencies or private agencies, to be transparent in terms of facts that relates to science, never mind, national security. Of course, they can have their secrets, but here we're talking about science. Then that is going to create real problems in terms of working with them, innovating with them, connecting with them. So we've got a billion people exploring a little less. We've got generally economic slowdown in China, so less capital, less investment, but also less just exploration. And then we've got lack of trust, which is going to mitigate the advantages of having a connected world, which is a huge negative.
So I want to end with the rise of, if not the actual kind of execution, but certainly the discussion of Web 3.0. And I mean, I think it's a little murky exactly what this means, particularly to those of us who aren't on the cutting edge of using it, but it certainly is incorporating things like blockchain technology. We've certainly seen crypto go more mainstream this year in a big way. NFTs, which have become huge, if still kind of a quirky little subset of the market. A lot of discussion from people like Mark Zuckerberg about the metaverse and being able to create a much more functional online world. And I'm curious as to your thoughts. My view is I still don't quite understand these things, but when really smart people tell me like this is going to be the future, I'm listening. And particularly I'm listening because I remember the same thing happening with the rise of Web 2.0, which is that the people who then were my age and older were saying, who needs this? It's a bunch of, kids talking about what they ate for breakfast, and it completely transformed our lives for better and in some ways for worse, perhaps. But what are your thoughts as somebody who I think has spent a little more time than me looking into this, but we're, I think, both outsiders to what's going on right now on the Web 3.0 front?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember the Web 2.0. I was a early investor, not my money, but an investor's money into a venture capital fund that ultimately was the seed investor for Twitter, and Twitter itself returned many multiples of the entire fund that they invested. So it was a huge home run. But I didn't, and they were talking about Web 2.0 and constantly, and I had no idea what they were talking about, and I had no appreciation for what it was. Luckily, I didn't let that personal bias affect my willingness to invest with them. I recognized that they knew a lot more about technology and about where it was heading than I did. Look, when I watch Silicon Valley venture capitalists investing heavily in the blockchain and in various forms of crypto and in new business models, in NFTs, and NFTs basically didn't exist a year ago, and now they're a massive market. Bitcoin is, I can't remember how many trillion. Of course, it depends on the day. It's been going down recently, but many $1 trillion market. It's a $2 or $3 trillion marketplace. Crypto generally, something is going on here. Something will come of it. I have no clue what that something will be. Sometimes when people describe to me what they think this makes possible, I get very excited because it seems like it's super powerful and super exciting. I think it will do a lot of things that I think we would really like. It would make communication even smoother, easier, better, easier for us to manage and monitor, fewer gatekeepers to decide who can publish, who can get his stuff out and who can't. You as a creator, for example, as a podcaster or whatever, you'll be able to own your content in a much more you'll be able to own it, and you'll be able to own who watches it, the lists, and a little bit like Substack, but much bigger than Substack, I think. And all secure in ways that nobody can erase ever, nobody can take away from you ever. Ever is a long time, but without shutting down the electric grid or something, because it's a distributed network, it doesn't sit on a particular server. So it looks like it's something that dramatically enhances security, dramatically enhances privacy, increases our control of our own. I mean, one of the problems with the internet is that it seems like once we provide information to, and I don't want to pick up Facebook, but anybody, right? Anybody on the internet, then we lose control of it. It gets out there into the wild, and we check off these things about we don't care, right? Because we just want to get the transaction done, so we don't read the thing. And of course, because of third-party doctrine, the government can access that data, because once you give it to somebody, the government assumes that you don't care about it, so they can take it, so they don't have to abide by privacy laws. But imagine, and this has been the holy grail kind of the internet for a long time, imagine if you could control your data, if you owned your data, if you could sell your data, right? If somebody wanted to know your buying habits, they could pay you for it and then advertise or whatever. I don't know how it works, right? But my sense is that the blockchain and some of these cryptos and some of the advances in Web 3.0 will make stuff like that possible, and will give us a lot more autonomy and control over what we do on the web. Now, that's scary when you think about some people, but overall, I think it's a net positive. And then if you add to that kind of the metaverse, like everything in tech, it depends how you use it. So if people are going to be with little headphones and not headphones, iPhone, I don't know what you call it, goggles, and spend all their day online and never leave, and that's their world, then I think they're going to lose a lot, right? They're going to, the connection to reality some is incredibly valuable, and certain things that you just can't replicate in cyberspace. On the other hand, it'll make possible a lot of very, very cool things. I mean, one of the things, we could be having this conversation in 3D as if we were in the same room, and, with holograms of each other reflected onto our desks. The world is not, it's not that far from that. My wife 2 years ago, I think before COVID, went to a concert, which was Maria Callas singing opera. And Maria Callas, of course, died in I think the early 1970s, the greatest opera singer ever. And my wife says Maria Callas walked on stage in 3D, looking lifelike, and sang opera, and facial expressions and body movements and everything in 3D. And it was all a hologram. And of course, because it was on a stage, you were further back, it was a little far. But my wife said it was almost like a live concert, live experience. And this is amazing. It's stunning technology, and it's just beginning. So the metaverse in that sense is going to enhance. I mean, think about how Zoom has enhanced our experience. Now take that and make it even, make it so that we don't know what it's going to be, because we don't. I'm excited about that future. I'm excited about what's possible.
All right. Thanks, Yaron. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. We will be back next week to wrap up the year, this time with Robert Hendershot. In the meantime, be sure to go to ingenuism.com and sign up for the newsletter. We will talk next time.
Great. Thanks, Don. Bye.